Hello, I'm Claude Kacser. I'm a 1000 child. Before I explain to you more about that, I want you to look at this absolutely adorable picture of someone, and if you can believe it, it's me at age 6.5 when I came to America in 1940. Look at my wonderful curly hair. And Thea said a wonderful booption, or I forget what. Okay, in any case, let me tell you my story. My birth name was Claude Kacser. Klaus was meant to be Scandinavian and said actually with a French accent, though my father's Austrian parents always called themselves Kacser. My immediate family was clearly well-to-do, upper middle class, and somewhat European rootless. Both my parents were very intellectual, cultured, much traveled, and cosmopolitan. They were Jewish, but non-practicing and totally assimilated. My mother, born in 1908, was a complex blend of German, English, and Swiss upbringing. She was born in Germany and had Austrian nationality by marriage. My father, significantly older than my mother, was born in 1897. He was straight Austrian and had lived and worked most of his adult life in Berlin and then in Paris. My parents met in Paris and ran a primarily French household until 1939, regardless of whatever country they actually lived. They met in Paris, spoke French to each other, courted in French, married in French, had me in French, so French was our language. As I say, my whole family is Jewish, and hence, of course, this whole story. Let's get more detail. I was born in 1934 in Paris, France, where I lived for a year with my parents. During 1935-36, we lived in Vienna, Austria, the home of my father's parents, I being aged 1 to 2. In 1936, we moved to England, I being aged 2.5. But in England, I went to the Institut Français nursery school and still spoke French. Came the Austrian Anschluss on March 11, 1938. Then Czechoslovakia and Munich on September 30, 1938. And Kristallnacht on November 9th and 10, 1938. Sometime during this period, my mother persuaded my father's elderly parents and his brother and his younger sister all to flee Austria and join us in England as Jewish refugees. My parents had no doubt at all about Hitler's general intent, and that he should not be able to reach our family. Sadly, my father's nominally Czech uncle did stay in Europe and was later exterminated in a death camp. Came May-June 1940. Blitzkrieg through Holland and Belgium, Dunkirk, and the fall of France on June 14, 1940. A German invasion of England became a very real possibility. My father was actually interned by the English as an enemy alien. English school children were being evacuated to the countryside, and some even overseas. My mother, sadly but definitively, decided that I had to be sent away from England. Fortunately, we had a distant relative in America. So followed much difficult moving around in England and several months of scouring for stateless identity papers and visas, and for escorts for myself on the steamship, etc. the arrangements took much skillful and persistent enterprise on my mother's part. And during this time, in early September 1940, the London Blitz began, the bombing of London. Finally, in late September 1940, I was evacuated to the United States by myself, at age 6½, to the care of a 51-year-old bachelor relative who sponsored me. Naturally, he was forced to place me in a sequence of 2 small boarding schools. In 1945, at age 11½, I returned to England, somewhat of a misfit, but at least able to join my family. From 1945 to 1952, I continued my school education in England, remaining somewhat of a misfit. Nonetheless, after some serious difficulties in gaining admission with 3 prior rejections due to consequences of my misfit status, I was finally admitted to Oxford University, England, a very prestigious university, and I ended up with a PhD in 1959. Then I began my English academic physics career. However, in 1962, at age 28, in part for professional reasons, I emigrated again to the United States. That was now under my own choice, and I've lived and worked here ever since. Of course, now I'm retired. This is not a typical 1,000th child story, since I went from Europe to the United States in 1940-1945, age 6½ to 11½, unaccompanied, living in boarding schools with a distant family guardian, then back to Europe, then finally and permanently to the United States. But I do consider myself as having gone through essentially the same travails and traumas as other 1,000 children. The follow-through simply took longer. Yes, I came from England. Most of the others came from Germany, Austria, and other countries. I had the great advantage that I nearly spoke English. Most of them had to learn English by being thrown into a school. So I may not be a typical 1,000 child coming to the USA, nor a typical Kindertransportee to England, but I did suffer all the traumas of coming to the United States unaccompanied at age 6½. Allowed to meet yet more strangers. I'd already come across the ocean in the hands of some strangers. Now an actual memory. A happy walk in 1945 with my nominal great-aunt Golda. I'm age 7½. I only remember this one single moment at all at that first school. It was when my great-aunt visited me during the fall, perhaps brought me an ice cream, and took me for a walk. As we walked, I held her hand, and I happily scuffed my shoes in the piles of leaves in the gutter. That is the only memory, happy or unhappy, that I have of that first boarding school and of the period 1940 to 1942. I think it important and significant to observe that I have no complete memories of this first period in the United States, and absolutely none of earlier times, up to the age of 6½. I believe this extreme absence of all early memory has an obvious explanation. A final early memory. My arrival at the second boarding school in August 1942, age 8½. I remember going into the dining room, being alone by myself, and eating tomato soup. I imagine we'd had a long trip, it was late, I was hungry, and here was some soup. And I imagine I was again helpless, and yet showing fortitude, and also miserable, whether I knew it, or showed it, or not. Here was yet another drastic upheaval in my life. once again in which I had no sense of security nor control. I was simply moved from one school to another, one group of people I didn't know to another group of people I didn't know. I did have one important mother substitute in the United States, aged 8.5 to 11.5 at the second school. There was one and only one warm, motherly human being, Aggie, the American Indian cook housekeeper. But much more important, she was the person all the kids went to for love. I went to her whenever I had hurt myself, whenever I simply wanted a hug. I do not remember ever allowing myself to feel unhappy, but in any case, Aggie was the one and only mother substitute any of the kids there had. I've been told I was lucky to have her. I agree. So what? I do not mean to present a pathetic picture of my life in America as a Jewish evacuee in 1,000 child. I clearly was a survivor. I still am. I do not think I actually allowed myself to feel sad and pathetic at the time. Though now, I'm quite sad when I think of that helpless survivor. I did not become a pathetic crybaby. Rather, I did what I was told. I did not rebel at age 10. Some other 1,000 children did rebel. They ran away from their foster homes, they got into trouble, etc. But not me. I was younger, age 10. Actually, I became somewhat introverted, a bookworm, and a to-be budding scholar. Of course, I did have and pursue many activities, though mainly my books and studies and piano lessons. I did have fun, as well as my chores, my little garden patch, the farm animals on the school property, and my stamp collecting. My bike, some swimming, the movies, even the excitement of the annual county fair. And my boarding school friends. But they too were all separated from their parents, for whatever reason. What were they really like? Nowadays my behavior would be called courageous. I disagree. I had no other viable choice. Fortunately, I did not become overpassive, nor overtly depressed. So, I did become a survivor, yet at significant inner cost. Luckily, I did have some active choices and interests to keep me going. Now moving on to the time when I got back to England, 1945 to 1962. That time was only semi-successful, between the ages of 11.5 and 28. Immediately after the end of the war, in September 1945, age 11.5, I went back to England and to my mother, who was in the throes of a divorce. So my mother was now a single parent at a time when this was still very unusual. Another toll of the war. But in fact, I was now a misfit in England. Educationally, socially, and culturally. I didn't know English history. I didn't know how to relate to English kids or English adults. And I didn't know what went on, basically, in England. Furthermore, my mother had her own very unusual background. Her complex blend of German, English, and Swiss upbringing, and her European rootlessness. For these reasons, my mother did not fully accept English norms, demands, and requirements. She operated with her own lack of true English socialization. She lacked English peers who could guide her in making decisions for my own life, other than her one truly English maiden aunt. And furthermore, my mother had progressive educational ideas. All these factors further contributed to my becoming more of a misfit instead of less as time went on. But perhaps even more significant, I do believe my mother was overcompensating for my 1,000 childness and actually made its negative impact even worse. My mother tried too hard in all her educational and other choices to lovingly make up to me for the damages that had already been inflicted upon me, through her own very difficult original choice to send me, a Jewish boy, unaccompanied to the United States at age 6½. So, back in England, instead of throwing me into the pack of English schoolboy wolves, my mother first protected me by sending me to a progressive school, and then to a further variety of very atypical schooling situations. Thus, over the ages of 11 to 18, I had no continuity, no schoolmates, other than one in high school, and even no family friends of my own age. I had no real friends of any sort. I was very separate and alone, with no opportunity to learn regular social life and skills. Instead, I studied and carried on. Indeed, the only place where I excelled was in school studies. Even so, my college applications were rejected 3 times by Ivy League Cambridge University. I did not fit any mold, neither socially privileged, nor working class, nor anything. Fortunately, though belatedly, through the good valid intervention of my mother's English aunt, my peculiar situation was finally explained to the admissions tutor at one of the Ivy League Oxford colleges. He did admit me and gave me a junior scholarship. I now believe he decided to take a chance on me. For the first year of my studies, I was very, very behind due to my strange high schooling, and I was continually working very hard to catch up. Overall, Oxford University was a very mixed situation for me. In time, I did shine academically with a bachelor's degree, first class, and so I continued into graduate studies. But socially, throughout my 7 years at Oxford University, I remained a misfit, an outsider, a trog, or troglodyte, Oxford's demeaning jargon for those who, as if, were subterranean cave dwellers. I was not even an angry young working-class man of the 50s. Oxford had changed somewhat since Brideshead Revisited, and Chariots of Fire, and Shadowland, and since World War II, but not that much. Even after I won a prestigious junior academic pre- and postdoc fellowship, I still felt an outsider. I was never comfortable with the civilized, cultured, sometimes class-conscious, and sometimes snobbish college faculty colleagues in other disciplines, whether postdocs or eminent full professors. Even with my fellow academic senior and junior physicists, I was meek and in awe of nearly all others. Actually, looking back, I now realize that some of them were quite willing to be my friends, but I put up this barrier myself. Both as an undergrad and as a graduate student, my personal social life was empty and bleak. I did not really date until at the age of 22. I did marry at 25, but that also had its unusual aspect. And so my final return to America, the melting pot. In 1962, aged 28, I decided to immigrate back to the United States. There were many reasons for that decision. The greater professional excitement and support for physics researchers in the United States, the job and general economic issues, the general ease and standard of living, etc. But one reason, unexpressed even to myself, the very salient, was to leave my English status as an outsider, and to come to a country where, nominally, it was easy to blend in with the scenery. The apparent ease with which one could find acceptance within a polyglot, multicultural society of upward strivers. And over time, indeed, this blending has happened, though I do not think I will ever feel fully American, nor do I want to. Actually, I still have a strong allegiance to England. The Queen, God bless her. I preserve many English values. England would nurture me and educate me for free in my formative years. Yet slowly over time, I have learned to be happy and content and at peace. At least in the main. But on to some personality issues. Throughout most of my life, I was a timid, introverted, repressed, non-social person. I definitely was not psychologically ready for my marriage at age 25. And surely that was one reason it ended 7 years later. Through much therapy, and through various later life traumas, and by the passage of time, I have at last become a happy, bold, extroverted, at times over-assertive, and at least a semi-social person. And after a long process of search and discovery, and self-discovery, and am remarried, and am very happy. She is a great wife. And indeed in American academia, I have finally melted in. So that took some time. I was still quite timid and academically in awe of my colleagues at Princeton and Columbia universities. I finally found my own niche and academic self-esteem at the University of Maryland, from which I have recently retired after 34 years. I am even becoming comfortable with and functioning within my Jewishness, under the positive influence of my somewhat overzealous Jewish second wife. But what a slow and tortured progress. My thesis repeated. I am firmly convinced that my whole life trajectory, my personality, my life choices, my career, my happiness or unhappiness, that was determined 70% due to my being Jewish, hence my being evacuated by myself from England to the United States, i.e. 70% to my being a 1,000 child. 30% due to how I was raised by my mother when I returned to England, which itself was very highly determined as a consequence of my having had to make me into a 1,000 child. She made that decision. And finally, 30% due to my genetic makeup. As I said before, that adds up to 130%, but all those things have strong interaction. In the end, I did make a success of my life, though the social, the personal, and the psychological, they took much much longer than did the professional. And even the professional had its meandering. Now at last I can say I am happy. In fact, I have contributed to America, professionally as a physics professor, a teacher of the next generations, as a researcher, and as an author of an introductory textbook. And socially and personally. Did my mother make the right choice in sending me away at age 6½ to America? After much thought, I now realize that question is for the birds. She did what she felt she had to do to save her adorable little Jewish boy from the very, very real threat of the Nazis. Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. Yet, my having been Jewish, and hence my being a 1,000 child, I'm sure that that is the most important determinant of my whole life. Again, this is me then, age 6½, my American green card given me when I arrived at the dock, New York, September 1940, to the care of someone I did not know. And this is me now, at age 74. So that's it.